Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of Act 1, Scene 3. We're going to talk quite quickly today to try and get through all of the second half of the scene from Arrival. In with this killer line from the Duke where he basically upends the social order, rejects Brabantio, accepts Othello, and also seems to sort of tacitly give the play's permission for Othello and Desdemona to be entitled to the relationship that they are living, that they have pursued here. We then get Brabantio talking about Desdemona confessing to this relationship. Now, normally we talk about confession to do with either a sin or a crime. It's a really interesting insight into the patriarchal society, as the test is where Desdemona's obedience lies. She must be obedient to a man. Brabantio's concern is simply with which one. Now, I think the arrival of Desdemona is really important. She is such an articulate woman in this scene. She gets her own way. She's very diplomatic. She's very brave. She is humble. She's respectful. She's absolutely wonderful. And that's really important because we need to consider her tragic trajectory and the way she gets reduced to this silent, cowed woman by the end of the play. And that transformation is really important. She doesn't begin the way she ends, okay? And we see her being this diplomat and demonstrating this idea that wife trumps daughter. It suggests the sort of natural progression of women's lives, particularly as she evokes her parents as an example to support her point. Brabantio responds to this in typical Brabantio fashion, where he declares that he gives with all my heart what he would have kept away from Othello. There's this sense here that he now says he's happy to get rid of Desdemona. Her disobedience seems to mean that he considers her deserving of the punishment of Othello, which perhaps is a nice bit of foreshadowing. I've mentioned before that the play, or Shakespeare, certainly does make the point that Desdemona does make a bad choice. Othello does end up killing her, remember. It's also worth noting that Brabantio refers to Desdemona's marriage as an escape from his tyranny. He previously said that she was quite happy living the quiet life. Does this word choice suggest that he knows that she was restive, or that any woman defying expectations is escaping, as it has connotations of disobedience? The Duke, however, is clearly over this conversation at this point and basically tells Brabantio to keep calm and carry on in 4 different ways in 4 rhyming couplets. It may be emphasising that this is common wisdom that he is partaking here, or that he is really trying to put an end to this. And again, the sound of this is very specific, this moment in the play, because it is echoed by Iago, who returns the rhyming couplets by basically telling the Duke of Venice to stuff it, and that there is no way he's going to just let it go. And it is completed with this final comment here. But words are words, I never yet did hear that the bruised heart was pierced through the ear. It's so wonderful, this, the idea that words are words, but this entire play is a play of words. Iago uses only words to bring Othello's entire world crashing down, as well as manipulating everyone around him. So this dismissal that words are words and that they don't really make a difference is really important, because you also get this sense that the bruised heart was, I never yet did hear that the bruised heart was pierced through the ear. And that is also played out to a certain extent. Once Othello's heart is bruised, once that doubt has started to creep in, there is nothing that's getting through, no words that Desdemona can possibly say to allay those fears and those jealousies and prevent the tragic climax. Iago's words make Othello impervious to Desdemona's pleas, so Brabantio is both utterly wrong and utterly right at the same time at this point. It's interesting to note that women are often said to fall for men like their fathers. I wonder if Othello realises how true this becomes later on, as he suffers from the same problem as Brabantio does. I'm not normally that interested in the prose poetry shifts for the purposes of exams, but the Duke's use of prose here suddenly feels very businesslike, especially following the long rhyming speech sections by himself and Brabantio. And again, remember, we talk about going to hear a play as often as going to just go and see a play at the time of Shakespeare. So the sound of the language does really matter, and that rhythm and that shift is very carefully calculated. And it's interesting that Othello, however, doesn't follow the Duke. He continues in verse. Makes it feel a little bit jarring, perhaps a little like he can't quite read the room. Now, for me, there's something somewhat pathetic about Othello in the rest of this scene, in the truest sense of the word of pathos. He's so desperate to prove that he's a soldier first and will do a good job. It suggests he knows his position is only secure as his usefulness, and how much loyalty could he count on were he to do badly. There's a subtle stressing of his otherness here. And again, we see Desdemona being very impressive and standing up for their relationship, getting what she wants, ensuring that she doesn't get left behind a moth of peace, but gets to go with Othello. And then we get some weird comments from Othello here, where he's assuring this crowd of men in front of his wife, who is the only woman in the room, that he's definitely not taking her with him to please the palate of my appetite, nor to comply with heat. I mean, we have to remember her dad's right there, guys. But there is an argument that this is also a reference to his race. Black men were often depicted as somewhat sexually voracious, so perhaps Othello feels he has to reassure them that his mind will stay on the task at hand, so to speak, and the focus will be on his job as the commander of the Venetian forces. So when he's saying, "Heaven defend your good souls, that you think I will your serious and great business scant, for she is with me," he appears to consider himself above such petty nonsense. But it's also emphasising that he's clearly unprepared for the emotional complexity of a life he has no experience of. We get this little section here from Desdemona, the Duke, and Othello about the time they're leaving. I think what we'd have to question is how Othello is saying that final line there. Is there a dramatic pause? Who's he looking at? These decisions would make a huge impact on these lines. Is he showing regret? Is he already ignoring his duties as a husband? Is he proving his eagerness to fight? Duke's final lines here are tricky. Some argue that this is referring to Othello's soul, which is clean rather than tarnished or black, and so is a good man, and Brabantio ought to be okay with it. But I think there is clearly also a racial component to this, and we're just a bit uncomfortable with the attitude it suggests. It's not particularly pleasant to see the Duke consoling Brabantio by saying that Othello is as good as a white man. Unfortunately, we can't rewrite historical attitudes, and we need to acknowledge their shadow. Now, I've done a little video on Brabantio's parting shot. For my money, the most important lines in the entire play. And isn't it just vile? But it's also worth noting that he completely ignores Desdemona. It's such a brutal rejection, and stresses that she has given up everything for Othello, and she will not be repaid for that sacrifice. So then everyone leaves this space, apart from Roderigo, who has been lurking in a corner, and Iago, and we have to deal with the wonderful display of misogyny between these two, which really leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. We have the slight comedic elements of Roderigo declaring, "I will incontinently drown myself," and again, the Tim McInerney version particularly really plays up the comedy of Roderigo, who seems to find himself in some Twilight-esque teen drama compared to everyone else. But what we do have here is the contrast between Iago's world weariness and expertise and knowledge of the world compared to Roderigo's somewhat romantic naivety, however irritating it may be. But then it really does take a turn where we go, ugh. So we see here that Iago is utterly convinced that it must be coming to an end. The misogyny and racism in these lines are absolutely key. And again, we always have to question how much of this is Iago, how much of it is him playing up to Roderigo. But this does seem to be quite a consistent thing. So yes, we've talked before about Iago's changeable character depending on his audience, but for me the comments here do feel quite authentic, if perhaps a little exaggerated. He does seem to presume that the marriage is doomed, perhaps to allay what little conscience he has. If this marriage is doomed anyway, he's just helping it along. He's not necessarily ruining anything. If Desdemona and Othello are both bound by gender and race to betray the other, then all Iago does is provide the catalyst. We could perhaps question if Shakespeare is creating a character some may agree with early on to provoke discomfort later as we see his behaviour spiral, perhaps presenting as a cautionary tale for those in the audience. Now we have some of our key quotations here. The idea that she must change for youth. These Moors are changeable in their will. The frail vow he describes their marriage as, betwixt an erring barbarian and a super subtle Venetian. That is such a dismissive attitude to both of these characters. And then we get that final comment I've highlighted here: if thou canst cuckold him, thou dost thyself a pleasure and me a sport. We're no longer trying to pitch Roderigo as winning Desdemona. He's simply trying to bed her so that he gets that sense of dominance and success and sexual superiority, and at the same time damaging Othello's standing, reputation and sense of self. We're going to be talking a lot about cuckoldry over the coming videos. At the same time as this, we have all this repetition of put money in thy purse. Well, at least he's got a consistent message. I hesitate to call this manipulation because I think it's more just nagging and browbeating, but it is effective and again can be done in a very, very funny way. I have to presume that Roderigo is supposed to be insufferably ridiculous, so seeing Iago control him so effortlessly and so obviously is a joy, but again becomes uncomfortable later in the play by the time we hit Act 5. There's a remarkably modern warning about turning a blind eye to early warning signs. Iago's attitudes are never okay, but there's plenty who might have him down as being on the right lines, so the audience perhaps permits or even encourages his bad behaviour at this point. Then later, as his behaviour escalates, we are already complicit, just like Roderigo, and along for the ride. It's worth noting that as his behaviour worsens, he speaks to the audience less. Shakespeare is indicating that we should be distancing ourselves from these attitudes through his structure there. So while his manipulation of Roderigo may seem entertaining here, we need to remember that he eventually persuades Roderigo to attempt to murder Cassio later in the play. The seeds of this extremely abusive and manipulative coercion is established here, and perhaps forces us to consider it as somewhat less funny. Then when we lose Roderigo, we have this wonderful about face where Iago immediately declares, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse." Now, we've debated about how bad Iago has been so far. This line indicates that his behaviour to Roderigo is practised. However, it seems that conning rich idiots is as bad as it's been. The Iago of the play is in new territory at this point. We finally get to that private motivation. Now that he's alone on the stage in his first big soliloquy, we move away from that public declaration about the professional jealousy and we get to the fear of cuckoldry. And now we see Iago confiding in us and some questions about his behaviour are answered. Now, despite Coleridge's motiveless malignity, for me, I think this line provides all the motivation that we need to understand. In a society where man's ego is so reliant on his wife's fidelity, mixed with an endemic fear of female sexuality, then rumours of Othello bedding his friend's wife would absolutely be destructive, and coupled with Othello's breaking with convention to promote Cassio, what more is needed? I think we'd be more comfortable if Iago had a better motive, or even was motiveless, because otherwise he's just a normal chap who, consumed by the green-eyed monster, blithely burns everyone's world to the ground. I admire Shakespeare in this. By moving Iago's motive from the public into the private sphere, he's signalling the domesticity of the ensuing tragedy, as well as forcing his audience to reflect on themselves, I would say far more than in Hamlet. This fear of personal jealousy is a situation we can all recognise. Thanks very much. I'll join you again when we get to Cyprus. Bye.